As you've seen from my last video, AAA games being released in a playable state is kind of a coin flip. Even some of the greatest games released in recent memory had serious issues on launch. Does anyone remember when Elden Ring had mixed reviews on launch because of the performance and nothing else? Baffling how a simple mistake like that can make people ignore everything good about the game. But at least Elden Ring had a lot to offer. What happens when a game launches with technical issues and has nothing to show for itself? Well, this has happened a lot actually. It seems like all big game studios have had at least one massive overhyped flop. And what's the internet's favorite way of ranking things? Well, I'll be ranking these launches based on a number of things. In short, how funny they were, how much of an impact they left, or how bad the game itself actually was. So here's our selection. We've got quite a few to get through here. I'm not going to be covering games like Call of Duty Vanguard or Madden whatever because those are from series that have been inconsistent with their quality for years and just shit out games every year for their zombie player bases. I'm talking about like new, interesting games where there was a significant amount of hype and people actually thought they'd be good. And a quick note, I'm not going to be talking about some older launches like Duke Nukem Forever or even stuff like Aliens Colonial Marines. I know they're not that old, but they're before my time and I pretty much have nothing to say about them. I wasn't there, basically. So anyways, here it is. We'll be starting with the S tier and working our way down to keep things interesting. So I guess there's no better one to start with than the topic of my last video, Cyberpunk 2077. And yeah, clearly this is an easy S tier for me. It was one that I was very excited about and one that I played on launch. You couldn't avoid this thing when it came out. Everyone was talking about it, and for good reason. The biggest part of the game that was talked about were the bugs, and yeah, there were quite a few of them. Although I never really cared about stuff like this, I was more focused on the gameplay and stuff like that, but they were still pretty funny to point out, and some of them were actually detrimental to trying to play the game. What I cared about more was the brain-dead AI, which made combat basically pointless in the super shallow world. The main thing the game had going for it was the graphics and the story, neither of which have gotten changed that much since it's gotten patched into the beloved game it is nowadays. This was the game that essentially ruined pre-orders for me. It was the last one I ever did pre-order. And nowadays, it stands as basically the definitive example of an awful release being patched into a fun and relevant experience. Next up is No Man's Sky. The S tier selection will be some pretty obvious choices in case you haven't noticed. And what is there even to say about this one? It was essentially a AAA game being made by like 6 people, given immense pressure by Sony. If you've seen the Internet Historian video about this, you'll know pretty much everything. We were promised the universe and given an experience wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle, as everyone was saying at the time. It just simply didn't have enough content in it for a $60 game because the devs didn't have enough time. My favorite part about the situation was Sean Murray's interviews and his lies and facial expressions. He was super vague about everything he was saying because most of it wasn't in the game. It was just stuff he thought he'd be able to add possibly within the game's release window.
Will I get bored playing this game?
Sometimes.
Will I get bored playing this game?
No.
Do different planets have different gravity?
No, your suit compensates for them.
So do you often go to planets and you're just like, well, this is just a total dud?
No, not that often.
He never had a bad heart, he just got over-ambitious with his schedule. I've actually played a decent amount of this game years later, and after all the patches and updates, it's honestly pretty fun. I could even say it lives up to the hype of the 2016 release. Most of the features that were promised but weren't in the game have been added, as well as many others. The only missing features are ones that wouldn't really make sense with the current gameplay, like landing on asteroids, when asteroids are used to collect resources by shooting at them in the game. Or features like flying between systems manually, which would be kind of pointless and overly ambitious to add. Now this one really stung. It clearly belongs in S tier for how disastrous the game itself was, with it essentially being a Fallout 4 asset flip with 16 times the bugs in it. I'll keep this segment brief because I assume you've all heard about this one. It's pretty infamous. Is it good now? I don't really know, and no one really talks about it anymore. What really made this game stand out to me is everything going on outside the game, all the scams and shitty merchandise. The Nuke at Dark video even leading to one of the worst like ratios I've ever seen. But I assume you all know this already. It was Bethesda's lowest point where even a brain-dead fan like me couldn't enjoy it. Moving on. Anthem was a colossal fuck-up, but not one that has a whole lot to say about it. It was hyped up as this Destiny killer, which clearly hasn't happened, and it hasn't even remotely improved since launch, like some of the others on this. It, from start to finish, seems like just such a generic and forgettable game with some of the most uninspired quests and characters. Some of the quests and characters in this game legitimately seem like AI generated. They're that fucking boring. The only reason it's not an S is because the launch of the game itself wasn't unplayable or anything, it was just extremely underwhelming. Halfway through the main story, there were multiple missions made to increase the playtime by having you do these shitty challenges like getting 50 out of 50 melee kills in the world. You know, the stuff that's normally reserved in these games for like miscellaneous garbage that gets you XP or cosmetics or whatever. No, quests like open 15 treasure chests around the world was actual main story content used to pad out the game. Besides that, everything is just so nothing in this game. It's about as generic as you can get. Of all the games in this video, this is the one I've played the most, which is kind of an unfair comparison, it being a multiplayer game and all, but Cyberpunk still comes decently close to my hours. With that being said, this one is almost purely here for the impact it made. I can't think of a game that's been more hated by the internet in years. Much like Fallout 76, this one is an extremely mainstream disaster where most of the issues have been talked about beforehand by everyone. So I'll just list them really quick. It had almost no changes on launch, and people expected more considering the original Overwatch was abandoned for 3 years in preparation for it. The major content was 3 new heroes, all with their own balance issues on launch in the Blizzard fashion. Some new maps, moving the game from 6v6 to 5v5, removing a tank, which I actually like that change. What's interesting about Overwatch 2 is that despite all the hate it got, people were still enjoying it quite a bit. It still has a decent player base to this day, because the gameplay itself can be pretty fun, despite the awful balance that Blizzard is known for. The major thing that was pissing everyone off at launch was the ridiculous monetization, which I can't even begin to get into that. And later on, there was the cancellation of the PvE mode, which really hurt. It essentially was the whole reason the game was a sequel, and it just got canceled out of the blue. But anyways, there's an obnoxious amount of samey, video essays talking about this shit, so I won't go into it anymore. Mass Effect isn't really a series I have any sort of connection to personally. I've never played any of them, although I do know the first 3 are some of the most beloved sci-fi games out there. I'll try not to pick the low-hanging fruit here, but yeah, the faces and the bugs were pretty much the whole reason putting it this high. Along with the fact that it essentially put an end to a beloved franchise after 5 years and $40 million. I've heard other things, like the story was a serious step down, a few of the characters seem to have very unclear motivation, it seemed very choppy, but again, I haven't played it, nor do I know much about this one. So I'll just leave it off here. Lastly, for the A tier, we have Redfall, and this one really stung. There wasn't anything really uniquely bad about this game, it was just a bad game overall. Plain and simple, it had outdated graphics, an empty world, horrible AI, cringy dialogue, and some of the most bland and generic characters and abilities I've ever seen. Some of these characters seem like they're 3D printed because of how generic and forgettable they are. And this one really sucked because I really like some of Arkane's other games, mainly the Dishonored series, and I was really looking forward to this one. Arkane says they don't want to be a Dishonored-only studio, but it seems like every time they try to make something besides Dishonored, it's mediocre to bad. Even the last Dishonored game they released, Death of the Outsider, was not that well received compared to the other 2 major ones. Their only other non-Dishonored series that seems to be actually kind of quality is Prey, honestly. Redfall is this high for the awful quality of the main product, as well as the decent amount of hype around it. Gollum, for some reason, got AAA funding and a massive license for such a weird, niche idea. Seriously, was anyone excited for this game? I remember seeing it at the Game Awards for the upcoming releases, but nobody gave a shit. And why would they? Who would want to play as Gollum in a stealth parkour game with some really shitty and shallow stealth and a parkour system that's as autopilot as it gets? Despite the lack of hype, nobody expected the game to be this bad. So bad that Angry Joe gave it his first 1 out of 10 in 7 years or something like that. I'm not kidding.
I hate it! I hate it! I hate it! I hates it! I hates it! The final verdict for Gollum is a fucking 1! A 1 out of 10!
At least it was kind of funny though. The game itself was such a catastrophe that the studio behind it, Daedalic, completely shut down their development side and are now just publishers.
I honestly didn't think things could get worse this year than Redfall. I was wrong. I severely underestimated Daedalic. Daedalic my balls!
I'm gonna say B tier for this one because of how bad the product itself was, even though there wasn't a whole lot of hype around it. Diablo Immortal isn't here for the core gameplay, much like Overwatch 2, Blizzard's other game on this list. The gameplay honestly is alright from what I've seen. It's mainly here for the ridiculous microtransactions and pay-to-win gameplay. Way back at the announcement of the game, Blizzard's own fanbase was turning against them at the convention simply because it wasn't really what they wanted from the game.
Hey, just was wondering, is this an out-of-season April Fool's joke?
No.
They essentially turned one of their flagship franchises into a money-printing mobile scam game, and it's seriously working. Yeah, side note, you want to know why so many game studios are doing shit like this now? It's because Genshin Impact made more money last year than Elden Ring. Just let that sink in for a second. And going back to the game itself, I mean, it's just the monetization. That's really the main reason it's here. I'm sure you've seen people spend like $13,000 to get like the good dust or whatever the fuck this like currency is. This game has like fucking 13 currencies. Star Wars Battlefront 2 is here for a very similar reason to Diablo Immortal, although this one is a bit more infamous. If you remember back in 2017, it was basically the game that started the massive war on loot boxes. It was pretty much the breaking point. The loot box situation got so bad after this game's release that it attracted the attention of several world governments and really got the debate of like underage gambling going. What about the game itself, though? It was fine, it seemed. The gameplay was alright, but it seemed like clear from the beginning that they just wanted your money. With some of the most pay-to-win gameplay I've ever seen in a multiplayer game, this whole fiasco led up to the most downvoted comment in Reddit history from EA themselves. It was actually a really big deal at the time. Saints Row seems to be one of those franchises with an extremely dedicated community that seemed decay as the years go on. Now, don't get me wrong, I've played some of Saints Row 4, and it's a decently fun game, if a bit shallow. But if you ask the old heads of this fanbase, they'll tell you these mystical stories about gang wars and interesting characters back in their 2006 heyday. So what made this one so bad? Well, it was buggy as fuck, it had this mediocre gameplay that essentially played itself. But most importantly, it had some of the most cringeworthy dialogue and characters I've ever seen in a game.
This is gonna be an epic statement. That yacht's guarded AF.
Dude, did you just say AF?
Yeah, it's an abbreviation.
First, we fucking swear all the time. Second, it's only an abbreviation when you text. AF, as fuck. Same number of syllables, dumbass.
Okay, fine. This is gonna be an epic statement because that yacht is guarded as fuck.
The rough and realistic gangsters from the original games were now replaced with millennial doom-scrollers who were quirky and relatable, and you get the picture. Some of the worst dialogue ever. Wrapping up the B tier, we have Forspoken, another game that is so bad it essentially killed its studio, merging back into Square Enix. Everything about this one is just so incredibly lame. The magic-based combat seems incredibly shallow, with you only unlocking some of the interesting abilities very late into the game. When this game came out earlier this year, it essentially got overshadowed by Hogwarts Legacy, and for good reason. The performance was just horrific and some of the worst I've ever seen on a launch. It also had a sprinkle of that Redfail and Saints Row dialogue. A boring mess that went absolutely nowhere, not even interesting to talk about. So in B tier, we had two multiplayer games that were hated for their predatory microtransactions. In C tier, we'll have two multiplayer games that just failed to deliver on what people wanted. Halo is a series that once again is a bit before my time, but the hype of this one was astronomical. While it didn't have the worst launch ever, it just seemed underwhelming with this shitty challenge-based progression system and lack of content. Missing modes like the Forge mode that previous Halo games had on launch. Stuff like this was eventually added in years later, but at the time it was too late. For what was supposed to be Halo's big comeback, it seemed like it did nothing but disappoint. But much like some of the other multiplayer games on this list, it could still be a fun time. Even on launch, you could still have fun doing the typical Halo gameplay loops. That's why it's not higher up for something so extremely hyped. You might be wondering why this one isn't higher, and the reasoning is simple. Battlefield 5, the game that came before this, was pretty shit on launch, so people's expectations weren't the highest. But players never thought it could get this bad. With countless bugs on launch and surprisingly awful hit registration making the game borderline unplayable, the awful balance of guns and vehicles, and the terrible design decisions like removing a scoreboard or voice chat to reduce toxicity. Not to mention its soundtrack, Battlefield 2042 was just soulless, and at this point it's been pretty much forgotten, with even the somewhat hated previous launch dominating it in terms of players. The developers at DICE even had some choice words for the criticism they were getting to make them look even more incompetent. Deflecting the blame of longtime players by calling their expectations brutal is not how you have a good impact on your fanbase. What a clown show this one was. Again, the only reason it's not any higher is because of the already low standards for the studio. So what happens when you take a skeleton crew that ported your older games to mobile and then ask them to port them back to relevant consoles and PC to make them more acceptable for the modern age? I was actually looking forward to these quite a bit for someone who hasn't played the original GTA trilogy, with them being a bit outdated for today's standards. This should have been an easy win and easy money for Rockstar, but instead they somehow made the games worse than their original versions that came out over a decade ago. I even remember that on launch, Rockstar's shitty launcher went down for like days after the release, so you couldn't even play the games. At the time I was actually using the launcher, I was just trying to play Red Dead Redemption 2, and I couldn't, which was frustrating. But imagine how pissed off the people who paid for this new definitive experience were when they couldn't even play it at launch. I heard that Rockstar also refused refunds, which is kind of just the cherry on top for such a broken and unplayable mess. So why isn't it higher after all that? Well, simply put, it's a remaster. There's not really too much hype around it. I have it on here over stuff like the Last of Us PC remaster because of just how awful it actually was. Finally, and in my opinion the least egregious of these launches, we have the most recent entry, Payday 3. So I'm already a massive fan of Payday 2, it's definitely my favorite PvE game out there, so I always wanted to give Payday 3 the benefit of the doubt. And honestly, it's pretty fun. The major issue at launch was the servers. You basically couldn't get into a game, and even if you managed to, you'd be lagging to shit. For some reason, you had to find a server to even play alone, so you could be lagging while playing alone. Thankfully though, a few days later, the servers got fixed and everyone was able to play a decently fun game, if not a little shallow. Yeah, comparing it to Payday 3 with its years of content updates is unfair, but even at launch this had systems that I wasn't a fan of, like XP being mainly earned through shitty challenges instead of just playing the game. As well as the lack of weapons, gadgets, and all of that shit. There just really wasn't a whole lot of variety or replay value, even compared to Payday 2's launch. But still, it's not that bad. The core gameplay itself is fun, even if it doesn't really do anything new. And that's it. I'll look at the past to remember all the most controversial launches we've seen. If I missed some that you were expecting, it's either because I didn't think it was bad enough to deserve a spot, or it just didn't make an impact to me. I don't really know what to add here in this outro that isn't extremely obvious, so bye.